imposed on business, especially in the side of labor and payroll taxes. And he was saying that especially in a weak economy, he was saying that, you know, on top of all the 74,000, the president just signed this new healthcare initiative, and that's going to raise taxes even further. And so he was saying, especially in a weak economy, I cannot necessarily afford to hire new labor that's already costing me a premium of something like 30 or 35% above their salary, and it's only going to go higher. In a weak economy, if I want to expand or if I want to increase profitability, I might actually have to cut labor if labor costs keep going up, or I might have to outsource. And he basically kind of lays it out. It's a very interesting piece. If you get a chance, I suggest you take a look at it. The piece is called Why I'm Not Hiring. And this is kind of playing out all around the economy. So if you think about it, you know, all the Krugmans of the world who agree with us about the free market say, well, yeah, the free market is good, but you know, right now we have a lot of weakness in the economy, so the government should spend money. They forget about the taxes, and you know, we end up with a worse situation than if we let things be as they were. The thing that businesses do want to be able to do is hire. If you really think about it, if you're a good business person, you know how to manage your business, you know how to expand, you know how to introduce new products, or you expand geographically, or you want to acquire another business, however you want to grow, growth strategies are a key part of business. Most business people don't just want to hire one person and stop. They want to hire another person, they want to expand, they want to introduce a new product line, they want to go into, you know, they're in Los Angeles, maybe they want to expand into San Francisco, or whatever the case is, they want to expand. That's when they know they're doing a good job, they maximize profits, they hire more capacity, they earn more money, they're happy, all is well with the world. This actually applies to everyone. So it applies to a smaller business person like Tina, who has 10 or 12 people in her company. It applies to a guy like Michael, who has maybe a couple hundred people. The guy that runs half of Las Vegas is a guy named Steve Wynn. You guys, anyone, you know who Steve Wynn is? Okay. He owns or runs the Wynn Resorts, he runs the Bellagio, he runs the Encore. He runs a bunch of other properties as well, both here in Vegas and overseas. He was on CNBC probably, what is this, October? He was on CNBC right at the end of May. And it was just a very simple interview. They were just talking about business conditions. He was talking about expanding in Macau. And all of a sudden, in the middle of the interview, he really starts to get ticked off. He starts to get really passionate because the interviewer asked him, you know, where are you expanding? And he said, you know, I'm expanding in Macau, China. I'm not expanding in Las Vegas. In fact, he's moving his headquarters. I think he's going to split his headquarters between Las Vegas and Macau. And they said, well, what about all the political risks in China? What about all the political, Macau is a specially administered region of China. So he said, what about all the political risks in China? And he said, this is when he really started to get upset. He said, you know, the instability, the political uncertainty is not in Macau, it's not in China, it's here in the United States. And he just started getting more ticked off and more ticked off. And he didn't mean to get ticked off, it was just, you could tell, it just kind of, you know, came from within. This is a guy who probably wants to expand in Las Vegas. I mean, he's put up half a dozen properties in that city. He could probably put up another half a dozen properties if he wanted to, but he can't because he feels like he's being constrained by all the uncertainty in Washington. If you get a chance, you know, go to Google or something and type in Steve Wynn, you know, CNBC. I think the date of the video was probably maybe May 27th or something, and you'll check it out and you'll see him. He gets really. He doesn't get angry, but you can tell he gets very emotional. He's very passionate about the whole thing. And
how do you spell Wynn?
W-Y-N-N, Steve Wynn. So, you know, the Krugmans of the world, I love, you know, talking about Krugman because he just seems to be the most visible, vocal person for, you know, sort of liberal thinking, liberal economics, spending, spending, spending. So the Krugmans of the world will say, okay, no problem. Here's what we're going to do. We're not going to raise taxes. We're going to spend the money, but to get the money, instead of raising taxes, we're going to borrow the money. Now this is even worse than just spending, other than just taxing, because ultimately you're going to have to pay that money back, right? So now when you raise taxes, if you do it a little later, that's fine. But now when you raise taxes, not only do you have to raise taxes to pay for the spending, you have to raise taxes enough to pay for the spending, and you have to raise taxes even more to pay for the interest. So this is even worse. As bad as it is to tax and spend, it's even worse to borrow and spend. If you think back to the example of, the Fleischer example, when he's got an employee that costs him $74,000 a year and who only makes $56,000 a year, something's got to give. Those taxes are going to go up even more. Maybe that employee will cost him $80,000 a year. Then what's going to happen? Either that person's going to get laid off, or they're going to have to take a salary cut. Something's got to give. You can't just keep raising taxes. That was the point of the Fleischer piece. I think he said something like, only government assumes that you can raise prices indefinitely without any consequences. He was saying, I can't raise prices on my customers, but in effect, the government is raising prices on the cost of labor, and there is an impact on raising that price of labor. This idea about borrowing and spending is what people sort of label as Keynesian economics. Right? Keynes said that what you do is, the government should act as a stabilizer. So when the economy is in recession, then the government can come in, spend money, run a budget deficit, and act as a stabilizer on aggregate demand. And then when the economy expands, the government can run a surplus, in other words, pull money out of the economy and sort of dampen down the boom cycle. So kind of smooth out the bust and dampen down the boom. And to me, this is the biggest disconnect that we have in this country right now, okay? We have not been running a Keynesian economic model in this country for 40 years. We have been running, effectively, pure deficit spending. Almost every year for the last 40 years, this country has borrowed money, primarily first from our own citizens and then from abroad. We borrowed money from Japan, we borrowed money from China, we borrowed money from the Europeans, we borrowed money from all the nations that export oil, what they call the oil exporting nations, and we've borrowed all that money and we've spent it. And now we owe a bunch of money to these foreign creditors. But the point is, Keynes, regardless of whether you agree with this idea or not, that you should spend money when the economy is in recession and you should pull back, government should pull back and run a surplus, so in other words, pull money out of the economy when you're in expansion. Regardless of whether you agree with that concept or not, I happen to disagree with it, but let's say you just happen to agree with it. The point is, we are not running a Keynesian stimulus program. We're not running true Keynesian economics in this country. In this country, we're just running deficits. We are borrowing and borrowing and borrowing and borrowing, and we've been doing it almost every year for 40 years. The last sort of president that had some budget surpluses and some budget deficits was Eisenhower. That was back in the 50s, right? Pretty consistently since Kennedy came into office, certainly since the Great Society, certainly since the Vietnam War, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Carter, Reagan, Ford, I guess was in there. Everybody has been running deficits. Everybody has been running deficits. Clinton had a period for a couple of years where he ran surpluses, but there's some funny accounting going on with everybody's calculation of budget surplus or budget deficit. There's something called the unified budget, which includes surpluses for Social Security. It's a big mess. The point is, on an operational basis, the government has been running deficits for 40 years. So this borrowing is really the cause of the current recession in our view, certainly in my view. If I can leave you with one idea tonight, it is this. It is that all this spending and all this borrowing that we have been doing is now an overhang on the economy. The current recession that we're in is not a garden variety recession. It's not like an inventory recession where businesses pull back for a quarter or two, the inventory is cleaned out, and then we go back to building again. This is what is known as a balance sheet recession. It's why we refer to it as a depression. I refer to it as a depression because it's not just 1 or 2 quarters of slow growth or negative growth and then we go back to growing again. This is a structural problem in the economy that is not going to go away. There are no quick fixes. There are no Band-Aid solutions. This is a big change. Our nation as a whole has been on a debt binge, not just government. Households and businesses have been on a debt binge for over 30 years, between 30 and 40, depending on which sector you look at.